She was scolded for wasting time comforting a child no one else noticed. But when the girl's billionaire father arrived, the entire restaurant froze at what he did next. The restaurant shimmered with wealth. Crystal chandeliers scattering light across polished marble floors, mirrored walls reflecting gowns and tailored suits. The clinking of glasses rising above the quiet hum of expensive conversations. Every table seemed to glow beneath silver platters. Waiters in black uniforms moved with a kind of rehearsed elegance, their trays balanced high as they weaved between the well-dressed guests, who filled the room with laughter that never reached their eyes. It was the kind of place where a meal cost more than a month's rent, where appearances mattered more than truth, where no detail was left to chance except for the smallest corner near the side wall, half hidden behind a tall potted plant, and the shadow of a grand piano. There, in that corner, sat a little girl, no older than 7. Her dress simple, compared to the satin gowns and sequined jackets around her, her shoes scuffed at the toes, as if they had been worn through too many playgrounds and too many days without polish. She sat hunched, her small shoulders shaking with quiet sobs, her face buried against a stuffed bear whose fur was matted, and whose ear was torn nearly in half. The noise of the dining room washed over her, but no one stopped, no one turned, no one cared that a child was crying in a temple of glass and gold. The hostess passed her by without pausing, her eyes trained only on the well-dressed couple who had just entered, her smile bright and brittle as she led them toward a prime table near the fire. A waiter brushed close, nearly knocking against the girl's chair, but he did not look down, his attention fixed on a tray of champagne flutes. Even the pianist ignored her, his polished shoes pressing the pedals beneath the piano, as his fingers danced out a song that was meant to soothe the wealthy diners, but sounded hollow against the child's muffled cries. Around the room, conversations carried on, laughter spilling out in sharp bursts, glasses raised in shallow toasts, men bragging about deals closed, and women showing diamonds that caught the light like stars. To them, the child was invisible, a misplaced detail in a room designed for perfection, and if they noticed her at all, they looked away quickly, as though the sight of her sorrow might stain their evening. Some whispered about whose child she was, others assumed she belonged to the staff, and most chose to pretend she was not there. Her sobs grew softer, tiredness dulling the edge of her pain, but her small hands clutched the bear tighter, as if it were the only friend left in the world. Every so often she lifted her head, eyes red and shining, scanning the room as if searching for someone who had not yet come. Then she would drop her face back into the worn fur and cry again. She seemed too young to be alone, too fragile for a place filled with cold laughter and sharp smiles. And yet there she sat, hidden in plain sight, while the luxury around her glittered and gleamed, uncaring. Anna moved quickly between the tables, her arms aching from the weight of plates stacked higher than they should have been, her uniform neat but faded from too many washes, her shoes worn down at the soles until they were almost smooth. Every step on the marble floor sent a dull pain up through her legs, but she kept her back straight, her smile practiced, and her voice steady when she spoke to the wealthy guests who waved her over with the same ease they used to lift their glasses. She had grown used to the rhythm of serving, to the constant hum of orders and the sharp whispers of her manager reminding her to hurry. Yet tonight, something tugged at her attention, something softer than the noise of crystal and cutlery. It was the sound of a child crying, muffled at first, hidden beneath the piano's melody and the clinking of silverware. But Anna's ears had learned to notice what others ignored. She turned her head and saw the girl in the corner, small and hunched over, her thin shoulders shaking as she pressed her face into the torn ear of a stuffed bear. Around her, the room glowed with chandeliers and laughter, but no one stopped. No one bent down. No one even asked if she was all right. Anna froze for a moment, a tray balanced in her hands, her heart tightening at the sight. Then she shifted her weight, ignored the impatient gestures from table 5, and walked toward the child. She crouched down slowly so she would not frighten her, the ache in her knees sharp but forgotten as she leaned closer. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice gentle, warm, softer than the polished tone she used for guests. "Are you all right?" The little girl lifted her head just enough for Anna to see her red, swollen eyes, then quickly buried her face back in the bear. Anna set the tray down on a side stand, ignoring the glare of another waiter who passed by, and pulled a clean napkin from her apron pocket. She dabbed it lightly near the girl's cheek, the way her mother used to when Anna herself cried as a child. The girl sniffled but did not move away. Anna smiled, the tiredness in her eyes easing for a moment, and she began folding the napkin into a clumsy flower, twisting the edges until it resembled a tulip. "Look," she said softly, placing it beside the bear. "Now your friend has a flower to keep him company." The smallest flicker of a smile touched the child's face, fragile but real, and Anna felt a warmth she had not felt in weeks. Behind her, the restaurant carried on. Her manager's voice hissed across the room, and the weight of overdue bills still pressed on her mind. But in that quiet corner, Anna chose to stay. She knelt beside the child, whispering gently, her worn shoes planted firmly on the marble floor, her tired heart steady, determined to give comfort where no one else had cared. Anna rose to her feet and slipped quietly toward the service station, her hands steady, though her heart was still heavy from the sight of the crying child. She poured a small glass of water, adding 2 ice cubes so it would not be too cold, and placed it on a tray as if it were the most important order of the night. Around her the restaurant buzzed with laughter and the clatter of forks against porcelain, but she tuned it all out, moving carefully back to the lonely corner. She knelt again, her worn shoes pressing into the marble, and held out the glass. The girl looked up with wide eyes, hesitant at first, but when Anna smiled, she reached out with both hands and clutched the glass like a treasure. She sipped slowly, her sobs quieting, the cool water soothing her as Anna brushed a loose strand of hair away from her flushed face. Anna pulled a crisp napkin from her apron, folding it slowly, her fingers moving with awkward care. She had never been skilled at crafts, yet she twisted and tucked the corners, determined to create something that might bring a spark of light. The folds came out uneven, the petals lopsided, but when she finished it resembled a tulip, fragile and imperfect, but still a flower. She placed it gently in the girl's lap beside the stuffed bear. "Now he has a flower to hold too," Anna whispered, her voice kind and steady. The child blinked at it, her tears slowing, her lips trembling as if unsure whether to smile. Then, as if the small gesture broke through the wall of loneliness, she let out the faintest laugh, quiet but filled with relief. It was not on any menu, not part of her training, but it was the first kindness she had received all night. And Anna felt something inside her ease. From across the room, Anna could feel the eyes of her manager burning into her back, could almost hear his sharp voice ready to scold her for wasting time. Yet she stayed kneeling, choosing to give what little comfort she could. The girl lifted the napkin flower, holding it up proudly as though it were made of gold, and pressed it against her bear's torn ear. The sight tugged at Anna's heart in a way no tip ever had. She knew she would face questions later, maybe even punishment. But she also knew she could not have walked past. Around them the chandeliers still glittered and the polished guests still raised their glasses, but in that small forgotten corner something rare had bloomed. A waitress with tired eyes and cracked shoes had given a child what money could not buy. A reminder that kindness could exist even in a place built on appearances. Anna stayed a moment longer, her knees aching, her voice soft as she asked the girl her name, and when the child whispered it through a shy smile, Anna felt for the first time that night that her work had meaning. Gregory's polished shoes clicked sharply against the marble as he crossed the floor. His face stretched into the kind of smile he wore for wealthy patrons, but replaced now with a sneer aimed at Anna. He had seen her kneeling beside the little girl, whispering softly as if she had nothing better to do, and in his eyes that was an unforgivable waste of time. The restaurant glittered around them, every table filled with customers whose bills would pay the night's profits, and yet one of his waitresses was crouched on the ground as if she belonged in the gutter. He leaned down, his voice low and sharp so no guest would hear, but each word landed like a lash. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his breath sour with coffee and cheap cologne. "You are here to serve, not babysit strays." Anna kept her head bowed, her tired eyes lowered to the floor, but her hand remained steady on the child's shoulder. The girl's small fingers clutched the napkin flower as if it were life itself, her wide eyes flicking nervously between the angry manager and the only waitress who had shown her kindness. Gregory's voice grew colder. "Do you want me to dock your pay again?" he muttered. "Because I will. Every second you spend here is money out of my pocket. You think these people care about some crying kid in the corner? They came here to eat, not to watch charity work." Anna swallowed hard, the knot in her throat heavy, but she did not rise. Her shoes, cracked at the seams, pressed firmly against the floor as she steadied herself. She could feel the weight of his anger, could already imagine the few dollars missing from her envelope at the end of the week, yet she could not bring herself to walk away. The girl leaned closer to her, hiding her face against Anna's apron, and that small act of trust gave her courage she had not expected. She whispered gently to the child, her voice low enough that only she could hear, promising that everything was fine, that she would not leave her alone. Gregory straightened, his jaw tightening as he glanced around the room, worried that one of the wealthy patrons might notice the exchange. He hissed again through clenched teeth. "You want to lose this job? Keep it up. You're nothing special here. I can replace you tomorrow with 10 more desperate girls from the street." His words dripped with cruelty, but Anna stayed where she was, her head still lowered in submission, yet her body refusing to move from the child's side. The chandeliers sparkled above, the piano notes floated across the room, but in that small corner a quiet battle was being fought. A manager's scorn pressed down like iron, but a poor waitress with tired eyes chose to resist not with defiance but with presence, her refusal to abandon a weeping child stronger than the fear of losing her wages. Gregory finally spat a curse under his breath and turned away, leaving Anna trembling but unbroken, her hand still resting on the girl's shoulder. Anna stayed kneeling, her knees pressing into the cold marble, her hand resting gently on the child's shoulder as the sound of laughter and clinking glasses swelled around them like waves crashing against a fragile boat. The girl's sobs had softened, though her small body still trembled as if the tears lived too deep to end quickly. She held the napkin flower tightly in one hand, the stuffed bear pressed against her chest with the other, its torn ear hanging by a few loose threads. Anna spoke softly, her voice careful, like someone tiptoeing in the dark. "It's all right, sweetheart. You're safe here. Can you tell me your name?" The child hesitated, her lips trembling, then whispered it so faintly Anna almost missed it. Hearing her own name spoken seemed to give the girl a little courage, and she lifted her tear-streaked face just enough to meet Anna's eyes. "My daddy," she said, the words breaking on her tongue. "He promised he would come." She clutched the bear tighter, her small hands gripping it until her knuckles turned white. Anna felt a sharp ache in her chest, the kind that came from understanding too well what it meant to wait for someone who never arrived. She smoothed the girl's hair back gently, brushing away strands damp with tears, and asked softly, "You're waiting for your father?" The girl nodded, her chin trembling as she pressed her cheek back into the stuffed bear. "He said he would be here, he promised. But it's been so long," she whispered, her voice full of confusion and hurt. No child should know. Anna glanced around the room, at the glittering crowd that ignored them, at the managers and waiters who rushed past, and she felt a quiet anger stir. No one had stopped to ask why a child was sitting alone in a restaurant where the cheapest glass of wine cost more than most families earned in a week. They had all seen her, yet they had all turned away, too wrapped in their polished conversations, to notice the weight carried by a little girl in a simple dress. Anna bent closer, her voice even gentler now. "Sometimes people get delayed, sweetheart, but I'm sure your father loves you very much." The girl's eyes filled again, but she nodded as if clinging to the reassurance. She lifted the bear slightly, showing Anna its torn ear, and said in a whisper that shook, "He gave him to me. He said he would always be with me, even if he was late." Anna's throat tightened, her vision blurring for a moment, but she forced her voice to stay calm. "That's a very special bear," she said, smiling softly, "and he looks very brave, just like you." The girl pressed her face into the worn fur again, as if hiding inside the comfort of her father's promise. All around, the restaurant carried on with its false sparkle, but in that quiet corner the truth of a child's secret weighed heavier than all the diamonds in the room. She was not just crying from fear, she was crying from the ache of waiting for a father who had not yet come. Time dragged like a heavy chain across the glittering floor of the restaurant, each minute stretching longer than the one before. The chandeliers still blazed with light, the pianist's fingers still moved across the keys, and the air was still thick with the smell of seared meat and aged wine, but in the shadowed corner, the little girl sat waiting with her stuffed bear clutched tight to her chest. Her eyes, red from crying, kept lifting toward the tall doors at the front of the room, each time filled with a fragile hope, and each time dimming a little more when the doors opened to reveal only another couple in evening clothes, or another group of businessmen laughing loudly as they entered. Hours passed, and still no father came. Anna remained close, her steps carrying her back to the child again and again between trays and orders, her ears straining for Gregory's voice snapping across the room, her heart heavy each time she saw the girl's hope falter. When she could not stand the sight of her small hands clutching the bear, as if it were the only anchor left, Anna slipped into the service station and tore off a small piece of bread from a loaf meant for the baskets. She wrapped it in a napkin, hiding it against her apron, and when she returned to the corner, she knelt as though checking the girl's glass of water. She slid the bread into her hands with a smile. "Something to keep your bear company," she whispered. The girl's lips trembled into the smallest smile as she nibbled at the bread, her hunger quiet but clear. Anna stayed kneeling, shielding her from Gregory's line of sight with her own body, her back straight, and her expression calm so no passing waiter would stop to ask questions. She felt the risk heavy on her shoulders, knew Gregory would rage if he saw food given away without charge, but the thought of the girl sitting with an empty stomach was worse. Across the room, laughter rose like the crack of glass. Businessmen toasting to profits, women flashing diamonds in the candlelight, and the hum of their shallow joy made the corner feel lonelier than ever. The girl whispered softly, her voice so small Anna had to lean close to hear. "Maybe he forgot," she said, her eyes filling again. Anna shook her head gently, brushing the child's hair back. "No, sweetheart, he didn't forget. Sometimes people get delayed. Sometimes the world keeps them away longer than they mean. But it doesn't mean they don't love you." The girl nodded, but her shoulders shook, and Anna felt a quiet fury at a world that could leave a child waiting in such a place. Gregory's voice hissed once, sharp as a whip, reminding Anna that her tables were waiting. But she only bowed her head and whispered to the girl one last time before standing. The night pressed on, the diners feasted, the chandeliers gleamed, but no father came, and the weight of that empty promise wrapped around the child like a cold shadow. The night had grown late, yet the restaurant still sparkled with the same polished glow, chandeliers throwing shards of light across the marble floors, the clinking of glasses ringing like coins in the air. The little girl in the corner sat slumped against her chair, her stuffed bear drooping in her lap, her eyes heavy with the weight of waiting. Anna stayed near, moving between her duties and the child, her heart pulled tighter with each passing moment, when at last a sudden shift rippled through the room. Outside the tall glass doors, headlights cut across the pavement, sleek and dark, followed by the hush of heavy engines. A line of black SUVs slid to a stop, their tinted windows catching the light like mirrors of midnight. The double doors opened, and the sound of the restaurant softened, as if the building itself held its breath. Conversations faltered, forks stilled against porcelain, and every gaze turned toward the entrance. A man stepped inside, tall and sharply built, his presence so commanding that the very air seemed to shift around him. His suit was tailored to perfection, charcoal black, with threads that caught the light. His tie knotted with exact precision, his polished shoes gleaming against the marble. His dark hair was combed neatly back, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the room with a force that seemed to slice through the glittering haze. Alexander Vale had arrived, the man whose name was whispered in boardrooms and printed in headlines, the architect of mergers that reshaped industries, the billionaire who commanded a $12 billion empire from the highest towers of the city. People spoke of him as ruthless, a strategist who never flinched, a man who saw weakness as an opening and opportunity as a weapon. Yet in that moment, standing in the doorway, there was nothing of arrogance in his eyes, only urgency, only a father's fear. The staff stiffened, Gregory straightened his tie and smoothed his jacket, his smile snapping onto his face as he hurried forward, though even his polished charm faltered in the shadow of Alexander's presence. The diners watched in silence, some whispering, some pretending not to stare, but all caught by the rare spectacle of true power entering their midst. Alexander moved quickly, his steps precise, his gaze sweeping the restaurant like a man hunting for something far more valuable than profit. His eyes landed at last on the small figure in the corner, the child with tear-streaked cheeks and a worn bear clutched to her chest. And in that instant, the fear in his face broke into something raw and unmistakable. The ruthless titan of industry, the man who could bend markets with a single word, was nothing more than a father who had found his daughter. His shoulders dropped with relief, his chest rising with a shaky breath, and without hesitation he crossed the room, the silence deepening with every step as the empire of wealth and power bowed to the quiet gravity of love. Alexander stepped through the doors with the weight of silence pressing behind him, his polished shoes striking the marble in quick, determined steps. For years people had whispered about his power, about the cold precision that had built an empire of $12 billion, about the skyscrapers that carried his name like monuments in steel and glass, but none of that mattered now. His eyes moved sharply across the room, scanning faces, corners, tables, searching not for investors or rivals, but for one small child who had not answered his calls, who had vanished into a city far too large for innocence. Fear cut through him like a knife, raw and unrelenting, a fear he never allowed his boardrooms to see, yet here it burned in full view. The diners felt it even before they understood, their laughter faltering as his gaze swept past them, his jaw tight, his breath shallow. The hostess tried to greet him, her voice polished and sweet, but he brushed past without a glance, his entire being locked on the hunt for his daughter. Gregory, the manager, hurried forward, his smile too quick, his hands eager to impress, but Alexander's eyes were not for him, not for anyone except the one he had promised to protect. He had conquered companies and swallowed rivals whole, but in that moment he felt powerless, every second without her a sharp twist in his chest. He moved deeper into the restaurant, his pulse thundering in his ears, scanning booths and tables, corners where shadows pooled. His mind betrayed him with images, the thought of her alone and afraid, her small voice calling for him, and for the first time in years, his steady composure cracked. He thought of nights spent locked in meetings while she waited with her nanny, of birthdays celebrated with expensive gifts instead of his presence, of the small broken promises he had excused with the shield of responsibility. The skyscrapers he ruled seemed to mock him now, monuments that could not hold his daughter's hand, glass towers that could not dry her tears. And then, in the far corner, tucked beside a tall plant and a grand piano, he saw her. His heart stumbled in his chest, relief colliding with anguish. She sat slumped in her chair, her small arms wrapped around the stuffed bear he had given her, the ear still torn, just as it had been when she first clutched it years ago. Her cheeks were streaked with dried tears, her eyes heavy from waiting, and beside her knelt a waitress in a faded uniform, her tired face gentle, her cracked shoes planted firmly on the marble. Alexander's breath caught, his fear breaking open into a fierce ache. For the empire outside these walls he was a titan, but here he was only a father who had left his daughter waiting too long. He crossed the distance quickly, his steps urgent, his eyes never leaving her face, every fiber of his being desperate to hold her again and erase the empty hours she had endured without him. Alexander's eyes locked on the corner, and the world seemed to still. The glitter of chandeliers dimmed, the clinking of forks faded, and even the piano faltered, as if the weight of his gaze commanded silence. There she was, his daughter, smaller than he remembered, fragile, and folded into herself, but not alone. At her side crouched a young woman in a faded uniform, her knees pressed into the marble, her cracked shoes tucked beneath her, her tired eyes filled with a quiet courage that pierced through the gilded haze of the room. The waitress had bent herself down to the child's level, not towering above her like so many others, but meeting her as an equal, her hand resting gently on the girl's shoulder, her presence a shield against the indifference of the glittering crowd. Alexander's chest tightened as he took in the sight. He had imagined his daughter abandoned, unseen in a place where no one cared, yet here she was, comforted by someone who had nothing to give, but still gave everything she could. The stuffed bear with its torn ear was tucked against his daughter's chest, and beside it lay a napkin folded into a clumsy flower, a token more precious than any diamond in the room. His daughter's small fingers clutched it tightly, her tears drying into faint stains on her cheeks, her face tilted up to the waitress with a trust that broke his heart. The diners, sensing the shift, fell quiet. They watched as the billionaire who commanded towers of steel and glass stood frozen, staring at his daughter and the poor waitress who had cared for her in his absence. Whispers fluttered across the tables, names murmured: Alexander Vale, the ruthless architect of mergers, the untouchable figure of wealth and control. But in that moment, he was stripped of all titles, revealed only as a father, overwhelmed by the sight of his child, safe in the hands of a stranger. Gregory hovered nervously at the edge, his polished smile faltering, his eyes darting between the man who held his career in his hands and the waitress who knelt in defiance of his orders. He had barked at her earlier, had threatened to cut her pay, yet she had refused to leave the child's side, and now the entire room could see the weight of that choice. Anna, still crouched low, lifted her gaze for the first time, and her tired eyes met Alexander's. For a moment, neither moved. She did not rise to flatter him. She did not shrink back in fear. She simply looked at him with the same steady honesty she had shown his daughter. Alexander felt his breath catch. He had faced rivals who would do anything for his approval, allies who bent under his power. But this young woman did not bow. She simply remained, anchored by something stronger than ambition. The room stayed hushed, the frozen moment stretching long and heavy, until at last Alexander stepped forward, his heart pounding, the distance between them closing not as a billionaire approaching a servant, but as a father approaching the one who had guarded his child's tears. Alexander's steps slowed as he reached the corner, his polished shoes gleaming against the marble, his breath shallow in his chest. The restaurant was silent now, every gaze fixed on him, the weight of wealth and reputation hanging on his shoulders like armor. But in that moment it felt heavy, almost useless. His daughter turned toward him, her small face streaked with the dried paths of tears, her stuffed bear still clutched tightly in one hand, the folded napkin flower in the other. The sight tore through him more fiercely than any corporate battle ever had. She had been waiting, alone. And it was not his wealth or his staff who had comforted her, but a young woman in a faded uniform, her tired eyes soft, her cracked shoes planted firmly on the floor, her courage greater than anything money could purchase. Alexander felt the ache in his throat swell until he could no longer stand tall. The power that usually filled his voice deserted him, replaced by something raw and human. Without thinking, he lowered himself, the fabric of his flawless suit brushing the marble as he dropped to his knees before the waitress. Gasps broke across the room like a sudden wind. Forks clattered against plates. Whispers rose like startled birds, but Alexander heard none of it. He was not the billionaire commanding attention. He was a father overcome with gratitude, a man stripped bare before the one who had shielded his daughter when he had failed. Tears glistened at the corners of his eyes as he looked up at her, his voice breaking as he spoke. "Thank you," he whispered, each word heavy with sincerity. "Thank you for protecting my daughter when my own staff and my wealth could not." His hands trembled slightly as he reached to touch his daughter's hair, brushing it back from her face, then letting his gaze return to the young woman who had remained by her side despite the scorn of others. Anna's breath caught, her knees still pressed against the marble, her hands steady on the child's shoulder, her eyes wide with disbelief at the sight of one of the most powerful men in the world kneeling before her. Around them, the diners stared in stunned silence. They had come expecting a show of wealth, an evening of polished surfaces and rare wines, yet now they witnessed something far more shattering. The man who owned towers of glass and commanded markets was bowing before a waitress whose shoes were nearly worn through, acknowledging that her simple act of compassion carried more weight than all his empire. Gregory stood frozen near the entrance, his face pale, his polished smile gone, the scorn he had hissed at Anna now exposed before every eye in the room. Alexander's voice steadied, though the tears still glistened. "I will never forget this," he said, his words quiet but carrying through the hush. His daughter nestled against him, but her small hand still clung to Anna's, a bond unbroken, and in that moment the billionaire bowed not just to gratitude, but to truth itself, humbling an entire room with a single kneel. Gregory stormed forward with a speed that betrayed his panic, his polished shoes striking the marble like hammer blows, his mouth already curling into the bright false smile he used whenever he wanted to twist a situation into his favor. His hands spread wide, as if he were welcoming the billionaire like an old friend, his voice rising high and oily. "Mr. Vale, what an honor. You must forgive the confusion. My staff can be so clumsy sometimes. I assure you everything is under control." He gestured toward Anna with a dismissive flick of his wrist, his words tumbling over themselves in desperate speed. "This girl, she has clearly overstepped, wasting time on distractions, ignoring her duties. I was just about to discipline her when you arrived. Please do not think we allow such behavior here. It must grold." Alexander remained on his knees for a moment longer, his hand steady on his daughter's small shoulder. But when he rose, the room seemed to shift with him. The murmurs hushed, the air heavy with anticipation, every diner leaning closer to witness what would come next. He turned slowly, his eyes locking on Gregory, and the smile on the manager's face faltered as if scorched under a flame. Alexander's jaw tightened, the tear that had glistened moments before, now replaced by a fire cold and sharp, a gaze that had broken rivals in boardrooms and toppled men twice Gregory's stature. "You," Alexander said, his voice low but carrying through the entire restaurant, "dared to threaten the one person who showed kindness when all of you looked away," Gregory stammered, his hands lifting in protest. But Alexander's words cut through him like steel. "Do not insult me with excuses. I saw my daughter's tears. I saw who comforted her. And I see you now, scrambling to protect yourself, not her." The diners held their breath, the chandeliers glittering above, as if the entire room had frozen in time. Gregory's smile cracked, sweat beating at his temple as he tried once more. "Mr. Vale, please. I was only thinking of the reputation of the establishment. You know how guests can be. Appearances must be maintained. Surely you understand." "Enough." The words snapped from Alexander's lips like a gavel striking. Gregory flinched, his mouth closing instantly, his entire body rigid beneath the weight of that single command. Alexander took one step forward, his suit catching the light, his presence filling the space like a storm. You are finished here. Effective immediately, you are no longer employed. Hand in your keys, your ledger, everything. Consider this your last night in this building. Gasps rippled across the room. Forks clattered against porcelain, and Gregory's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, but no sound came, his career unraveling before the eyes of every guest he had ever tried to impress. Anna stayed still beside the child, her hands trembling only slightly, her tired eyes wide, as she watched power turn its gaze not on her, but on the man who had scorned her. Gregory stumbled back, his arrogance stripped away, the fall of his authority echoing louder than any toast. The silence in the restaurant stretched long after Gregory's retreat, the clatter of dishes hushed, the pianist's hands hovering above the keys as if even music dared not intrude. Alexander stood tall, his arm protectively around his daughter's shoulders, but his eyes softened as he looked down at her small face. The fear that had carved lines into his features eased just slightly, though his chest still rose and fell with the uneven rhythm of a man who had nearly lost something irreplaceable. His daughter blinked up at him, her cheeks still pink from tears, and then with slow, careful fingers she lifted the napkin flower from her lap. The folds were crooked, the petals uneven, the edges crumpled where she had held it too tightly, but she smiled through her trembling lips as she pressed it into his hand. "She made this so I wouldn't cry," the little girl whispered, her voice soft but carrying into the hush of the room. For a moment Alexander did not move. His hand, accustomed to signing contracts worth millions, trembled as he closed his fingers around the fragile shape. The texture of the linen was rough, the folds imperfect, yet it felt heavier than any treasure he had ever held. His daughter's words echoed inside him, louder than the roar of markets, louder than the applause of shareholders. He looked at Anna, still kneeling beside the chair, her head lowered slightly, as if uncertain whether she should stay or vanish into the shadows. Her uniform was faded at the seams, her shoes cracked at the soles, her face marked with the fatigue of long hours and too little rest, but in her eyes lingered something unshakable. Compassion, courage, a refusal to turn away from a child others had ignored. Alexander's throat tightened, and he closed his hand more firmly around the napkin flower, feeling the strength of its meaning. Around them the diners watched with wide eyes, stunned into silence. Some shifted uncomfortably, embarrassed by their own indifference, while others leaned forward, caught by the sight of unimaginable wealth, bowing before something so small and ordinary. Alexander bent lower to his daughter, holding the napkin flower carefully between them. "This is the most precious gift anyone has ever given me," he said, his voice hushed, breaking with emotion. The girl's eyes glistened as she nodded, her small fingers still gripping her bare. Anna finally lifted her gaze, and for the briefest moment their eyes met. No words were spoken, yet Alexander felt the weight of gratitude push through his chest like a tide. Gratitude deeper than anything he had expressed before. His fortune had bought towers of glass, fleets of cars, endless tables like the one before them, but none of it had protected his daughter. It was this woman, worn and weary, who had given her comfort and handed him a folded napkin that now trembled in his powerful grasp like a holy relic. Alexander stood for a long moment, with the napkin flower still trembling in his hand, his gaze shifting between the crooked folds of linen and the young woman who had made it. The room had settled into a fragile, quiet, the guests whispering at their tables but too enthralled to look away, the pianist letting his hands rest lightly on the keys without striking a note. Anna remained where she was, crouched at the child's side, her posture humble yet steady, her fingers resting gently against the girl's shoulder as if she were prepared to guard her from the world a little longer. Alexander's throat tightened with the weight of everything left unsaid. He bent lower, his voice quiet, a father's voice, not the voice that toppled rivals and commanded empires. "Tell me," he asked, his words thick with emotion, "why did you stay with her when no one else would? Anna lifted her head slightly, her tired eyes meeting his for the first time without flinching. There was no calculation in them, no desire for reward, only a calm honesty that pierced through the glittering walls around them. She shrugged softly, almost embarrassed by the question, and answered in a voice low but steady. "Because no child should feel forgotten," she said. Her words simple, unadorned, and true. "Not here, not anywhere." The reply landed inside him like a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples through every layer of his being. Alexander Vale had listened to speeches from presidents, negotiations from tycoons, and presentations polished by the brightest minds money could buy. Yet none of those words had ever struck him the way these did. There was no pretense in her voice, no ambition, no attempt to impress, just truth. He felt the burn of tears press harder against his eyes, not from shame, but from the clarity she had handed him so easily. His daughter leaned closer to Anna, her small hand slipping into the waitress's worn fingers, and Alexander saw the bond between them, built not from wealth or power but from the smallest act of kindness. He thought of his own life, of the skyscrapers that bore his name, of the endless deals that had stolen hours from his daughter, of the broken promises that had stacked silently between them. A waitress in a faded uniform had given his child what all his fortune had failed to provide: the feeling of being seen, the reassurance of being loved in a moment of fear. The diners sat motionless, some ashamed, some awed, their eyes shifting uneasily as they realized they had done nothing when a child wept before them. Gregory lingered near the shadows, his jaw tight, knowing his power had crumbled with every word Anna spoke. But Alexander barely noticed them anymore. His entire world had narrowed to the truth revealed in those few honest words. He reached out, his hand trembling, and placed it gently over Anna's. "Then you have done more for her than I ever have," he whispered, his voice breaking. The room seemed to hold its breath. As Alexander straightened, his daughter tucked close against his side, the folded napkin flower still resting carefully in his hand. Guests expected him to leave, to sweep his child into the night and vanish behind tinted windows. But instead, he turned toward the hostess, his voice calm yet firm. "A table for 3, he said, the words carrying through the hush like a declaration. The hostess blinked, uncertain, then nodded quickly, her hands trembling as she guided them to the very center of the room. Gregory shrank further into the shadows, powerless to stop what unfolded. The billionaire who commanded skyscrapers and boardrooms chose not to retreat to privacy, but to remain, to sit in plain view, to rewrite the evening in a way no one had imagined. Anna hesitated as Alexander gestured for her to join them, her hands tightening nervously around her apron. She shook her head once, whispering that she could not, that she was only a waitress. But his daughter tugged her gently forward with a smile, too innocent to refuse. "Please sit with us," the little girl said softly, her eyes still glistening with trust. Alexander pulled out a chair himself, lowering it toward Anna with a quiet insistence that made refusal impossible. For the first time, she sat at a table she had only ever approached to serve, her faded uniform brushing the linen cloth, her cracked shoes tucked beneath polished marble where diamonds usually glittered. Bread was set down by another waiter, his movements stiff with shock, and Alexander broke a piece, placing it first in his daughter's hands, then offering some to Anna before taking his own. The simple gesture, sharing bread across a table where she had never been welcome, felt heavier than any contract he had signed. For Anna, the crust was plain, the same bread she carried to hungry mouths at other tables, but tonight it tasted different, touched by dignity rather than duty. Alexander watched her as she sat carefully, her shoulders tense at first, then slowly easing as his daughter leaned against her with the comfort of family. He asked no questions of profit or loss, spoke no words of deals or markets, only gentle ones, about the girl's favorite games, about the bear with the torn ear, about the flower folded from a napkin. Anna answered softly when asked, her voice modest, never reaching beyond what was needed, but each word carried the strength of someone who had chosen compassion in a room where it was rare. The diners whispered behind their hands, astonished that the man who could summon empires with a phone call was breaking bread with a waitress, treating her as an equal before their eyes. Yet Alexander felt no shame, only a rising certainty that he was exactly where he should be, beside his daughter and the young woman who had kept her from despair. The glittering chandeliers still shone above, but for once they illuminated not wealth or status, but the fragile beauty of three people sharing bread together. The night after the dinner for three, Alexander sat in his penthouse office, the city stretching out in glittering lights below him. But his thoughts were not on the towers he owned, or the markets he controlled. His daughter was safe asleep in the next room, clutching the stuffed bear and the napkin flower, yet his mind returned again and again to the young woman who had sat across from him, her uniform worn thin, her hands rough from endless hours of work, her eyes carrying a weight that no one her age should bear. He needed to know more, not out of suspicion, but because gratitude had carved a question into his heart. Who was Anna, the waitress who had given his daughter comfort when the world had looked away? Arthur Pendleton, his trusted COO, stood across the desk, a folder in his hands. Arthur had served him faithfully for decades, the steady anchor in storms of profit and power, the man who could turn whispers of rumor into hard fact by dawn. "I've done the research," Arthur said quietly, sliding the folder forward. Alexander opened it, bracing himself, and what he saw deepened the ache in his chest. Anna was 22, born and raised in the city's narrow streets, a life far removed from glass towers and shining ballrooms. Her father had vanished years ago. Her mother left battling an illness that kept her bedridden, her medicine costs climbing higher with every month. Anna had been forced to abandon her college classes, where she had shown promise in accounting, and had taken on double shifts at the restaurant simply to keep the lights on in their small apartment. She owed debts that were never truly hers, fabricated numbers whispered into ledgers by Gregory, who had exploited her exhaustion and her desperate need for work. Arthur's research confirmed what Alexander had already sensed, that Gregory had trapped her, holding the threat of dismissal over her like a blade, stealing her wages through deceit, all while she bore it silently for the sake of her mother. Alexander's hand trembled slightly as he turned each page. The photographs of overdue bills, the records of shifts longer than the law allowed, the notes of her visits to clinics for her mother's care. He thought of her cracked shoes, the faint circles under her eyes, the quiet way she had knelt beside his daughter without hesitation. None of it was theater, none of it calculated. It was simply the life of a woman forced to carry burdens too heavy, yet still willing to give comfort to a stranger's child. Arthur's voice softened as he closed the folder. "She's done everything she can to keep her family afloat. She's never asked for help, never sought pity. But she's drowning, Alexander. Without intervention, she won't last much longer under this weight." Alexander leaned back, his chest heavy, the city lights blurring through the glass. For all his power, for all his billions, it was Anna who had shown strength greater than his. She had chosen kindness despite exhaustion, dignity despite humiliation, and now, armed with the truth, Alexander knew her story was not just background to a single night, but the beginning of a change his empire could no longer ignore. Morning light spilled across the glass towers of the city, but in Alexander's office the glow felt colder, sharper, as if the skyline itself was demanding an answer. He stood at the long conference table, his daughter's napkin flower resting beside a stack of files Arthur had gathered, and his executives seated stiffly in their tailored suits. For years they had looked at him as the architect of ruthless victories, a man who measured loyalty in profit margins. But today his gaze carried a different weight, one that made them shift uneasily in their chairs. He spoke with a voice low and steady, yet each word landed like a strike. "I built this empire on the promise of excellence," he said, his hand resting lightly on the folded napkin. "But what I saw last night was not excellence. It was rot. A child was left crying in my restaurant while my staff looked away. A young woman was threatened, her wages stolen, her dignity stripped, and all of it under the nose of management I trusted. His eyes swept the table, stopping on each executive until they lowered their gaze. This is not failure of one man. This is failure of a culture, and it ends now. Arthur slid forward the files, detailing Gregory's exploitation, the fabricated debts, the garnished paychecks, the hours beyond regulation. Alexander turned the pages slowly, forcing the silence to deepen. Gregory Finch may have been the face of this, but he is not alone. The culture that allowed him to thrive was ours. We polished the surface and ignored the cracks. We counted the profits and never asked whose backs carried them. From this day forward, that changes. One executive cleared his throat, mumbling that staff turnover was common in hospitality, that these things happened everywhere. But Alexander's hand struck the table with sudden force. The napkin flower quivered, yet remained standing. His eyes hardened. Do not tell me this is normal. Do not tell me exploitation is the cost of doing business. That language ends here. If you cannot see the value in protecting the dignity of the people who build our empire, then you will not belong in it. A hush settled, heavier than any balance sheet. The men and women who once admired his cold efficiency now saw something sharper, not softer but deeper, a resolve forged from more than numbers. Alexander straightened, his voice clear. We begin at the gilded steer. Every ledger will be reviewed, every practice audited, every dishonest manager removed. I will not run an empire that poisons its own people. From there we move outward, division by division, until Blackwood Holdings is not just profitable, but just. Arthur nodded quietly, his steady presence anchoring the moment. And for the first time, Alexander felt that the promise of change was not an ideal, but an action already unfolding. He looked once more at the napkin flower, crooked and fragile yet unshakable, and thought of the waitress who had given it to his daughter. If she could hold her ground in a world designed to silence her, then he, with all his power, could do no less. The boardroom was a cathedral of glass and steel, its long, polished table gleaming under recessed lights, the skyline stretching beyond the windows like a painting of wealth and control. Executives sat in silence, their hands folded neatly on the table, their expressions composed yet wary, for they sensed that this meeting would not be like the others. At the head of the table stood Alexander, his presence steady, his voice calm, but charged with a weight that commanded attention. He had spent days combing through reports, unraveling practices that had been hidden behind numbers and polished smiles, and now the time had come to set a new course. He placed a single object on the table, the folded napkin flower his daughter had kept by her bed since that night. Its petals were bent, its edges softened, yet it stood upright, a fragile emblem of courage in a world that had forgotten honesty. Alexander let the silence stretch as every eye turned toward it, puzzled, curious, uneasy. This, he began slowly, represents more than numbers or profit margins. It represents integrity. It was given to my daughter by someone who had nothing to offer but kindness, and in doing so she gave me more than any contract ever has. He let his gaze sweep across the table, his eyes hardening just slightly. Our company has built towers, but we have forgotten the foundation. We have measured growth in billions, but ignored the suffering of the people whose hands carried it. That ends today. We will not discard our workers. We will not humiliate them. We will not turn a blind eye to corruption hidden behind polished ledgers. Murmurs rippled, some shifting in their seats, but Alexander raised a hand, silencing them. I am announcing the creation of a new position, Director of Cultural Integrity and Employee Welfare. This role will ensure that every voice is heard, that no one is silenced, that dignity is woven into the fabric of this empire, and I have chosen the person who will lead it. The door opened quietly, and Anna stepped into the boardroom. She wore no uniform tonight, only a simple dress, her hair pulled back neatly, her shoes still plain but clean, her eyes wide but steady. She paused under the weight of their stares, yet did not falter, her presence small in stature but immense in meaning. Alexander's voice softened as he looked toward her. "This is Anna, the waitress who refused to walk away from a child left crying in my restaurant. She stood where others turned their heads. She protected dignity when power failed to do so. She will lead us now in building a culture that does not forget the human cost." The executives exchanged glances, some skeptical, some humbled, but none dared speak against him. Alexander moved to her side, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of both protection and respect. "Anna Vance will be the guardian of integrity within this empire," he declared, his voice carrying like a verdict. "And through her, we will ensure that no worker is ever discarded or humiliated again." Weeks later, the restaurant glowed with the same chandeliers, the same polished marble, the same golden haze of light, but something within its walls had changed. The staff moved differently, their shoulders straighter, their eyes brighter, as if the weight of fear had been lifted from them. Guests entered with their usual laughter and elegance, yet even they felt a new tone humming beneath the surface, a quiet respect that had not existed before. At the far corner, near the piano, sat the table that once held sorrow, the small place where a little girl had cried unnoticed while the world turned away. Tonight that same table was set again, its linen crisp, its glasses gleaming, yet its meaning transformed. Alexander sat with his daughter beside him, her hair tied neatly with a ribbon, her cheeks glowing with the warmth of someone who had been seen and loved. In front of her lay the stuffed bear with its torn ear, and next to it rested the napkin flower, preserved carefully as though it were made of silk instead of linen. She touched it gently, smiling, her young eyes filled with a light no diamond in the room could match. Across from them sat Anna, no longer hidden in a faded uniform, no longer dismissed as just a waitress, but still humble, still steady, her hands folded neatly on her lap as she looked around the place where she had once been scorned. The waiters who passed nodded at her with quiet respect, remembering how she had knelt in defiance of cruelty, how she had chosen kindness despite the cost. Alexander watched them too, his chest swelling with pride that went beyond profit, pride not in his empire, but in the shift it was undergoing. He broke a piece of bread, offering it first to his daughter, then to Anna, just as he had done that night when everything began. The act was simple, almost ordinary, yet it carried the weight of promise, the unspoken vow that the future would be built differently. Conversation flowed more easily than he expected, laughter from his daughter mixing with Anna's gentle voice, the two of them leaning close as though they had been family all along. Alexander sat back for a moment, his gaze fixed on the flower in the center of the table, the crooked folds still holding strong. It had become more than a keepsake. It was a symbol of a turning point, a reminder that wealth alone could not build a legacy, but compassion could. He reached across the table, his large hand covering Anna's smaller one, his grip warm and steady. The room around them blurred, the chatter, the glitter, all fading until only the three of them remained. His voice was low, meant for her alone, yet it carried with the strength of truth. "My daughter will never forget you," he whispered, his eyes glistening, "and neither will I." Anna's breath caught, her lips trembling into a quiet smile. And in that final image, the empire of Alexander Vale was no longer just towers of glass, but a foundation built on dignity and love. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.